Hi, my name's Amber, and I'm looking at a differentiated school model for my current events in education project. Now, let's look at how public school currently operates. We should all be pretty familiar with this. We all went through school of some type, and even most private schools are operated the same way that public schools are. Students are divided by age. When you start kindergarten, you're 5. When you graduate your senior year in high school, you're 18, give or take a month or two. Students go from one grade to the next, regardless of how well they understand the material. It takes a lot for a student to either skip a grade or be held back. Now, should more students be grade skipped or held back? Probably so, but for the most part, students go from one grade to the next at the end of the year, regardless of how well or how poorly they've understood the information presented to them. Students learn a set amount each year. Grades are divided up into curriculum, and the school district and the state determines what standards are taught in each grade each year. Now, some students might not learn all of the material presented, and some students might learn a little bit more or dive a little bit deeper through some differentiation from the teachers or just their own life experiences, something they do with their family, or some sort of a summer camp or a camp over fall or winter break. Why is this a problem? So what makes the current model of education not ideal? Well, every student is different. If you have more than one kid, you know that each of your kids are very different. They're growing up in the same house. They have the same set of circumstances provided to them, and yet they're just different. Now, some students might already know something, or they might get a concept super fast. And then they have to spend the rest of the unit working on the same subject that they already knew day one, and that can be kind of boring. On the flip side, there's some students that might really struggle. I struggled with math. I could probably take each math class offered in high school 2 or 3 times before I really understand the content in those courses. And so some students in some subjects might need more time, and they might not be ready to learn a concept. I think something that's been talked about in the news a lot in recent years is that especially boys aren't necessarily ready to learn and sit down to really work on reading skills at 5 or 6. It's not normal or natural for most boys. Girls don't seem to have this problem. They tend to mature a little bit faster, and they're ready for more content. Like this comic says, do we need this even if we're not planning to go to college? This is an issue that's more prevalent in secondary education. Some students know without a doubt they are not going to college. They want to go into a trade, or they're just not interested, or they haven't done well enough in school to really warrant a college education where they are currently. It doesn't mean that they can't go back. It doesn't mean that they can't get more education or remedial courses and get there, but they're not currently ready for it. So why are we making them take college prep classes in high school? Likewise, if you know you want to be going to college, but you want to go to college for an English degree, why do you have to be taking math or a lot of math? Let's let students and their families decide what the right path for students are. So, is there a better way? We've decided that the way public education currently is set up might not be the best way. Well, Richard Cullenberg He is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. He writes that grouping students by ability, it's a challenging issue. It's a hot button topic and a lot of people have a lot of opinions on it, but unfortunately there's not a whole lot of data to support either side. He says that individual students vary in ability, but sometimes people are a little concerned that tracking or grouping by ability might be unfair to lower income students or for minority students. And he has some valid concerns. So the positives of ability-based grouping, it benefits higher achievers. So if you are ready, if you're a student and you are ready to move on, when you have ability-based grouping, you can move on regardless of how old you are. You can move on to the next course, the next topic. It also benefits struggling students. If you need to spend more time with that material, you have the option to spend more time with that material. And it also is a benefit for teachers. When you group students based on ability instead of age, you end up only having to teach one group of students at a time. Currently in my daughter's first grade class, there are students who are still working on letter identification, and there's students who are reading chapter books. That's a huge range of academic achievement to have to balance your lessons for, because if you are doing letter identification, your chapter book students, they're bored. Whereas if you're doing chapter books, your students that are working on letter identification, they're completely lost. And maybe they enjoy the story, but they're not learning those skills the chapter book reader kids are. And there's nothing wrong with not being ready for chapter books. And there's nothing wrong with working on letter identification. It's the fact that being able to teach one lesson that reaches all of those kids equally is nearly impossible for those teachers. The challenges of ability-based grouping. So there's also some things that are more difficult when you start dividing students based on ability. It's difficult to put into practice. There are many things that currently we have in this school system that are really tough to change. We have these buildings and they're designed with different groups of kids in mind. Schedules and how we hire teachers and how teachers are taught to teach are all designed with age in mind instead of content or level of instruction. So when you change a school or a district to ability-based grouping versus age, it comes with its set of challenges. Many people fear that when you change to ability-based grouping, it may lead to social and racial inequities. So a lot of people fear that when you divide a school up based on ability, the students with lower socioeconomic status or of minority races typically tend to go into the lower tracks that are developed, whereas wealthier, whiter students tend to occupy the top rungs and tend to have more mobility through the ability-based system. The other problem is that there's little data on the benefits or on the drawbacks because there haven't been many schools or districts that have put things like this into place. And the ones that have, there's not a really long track record to test and see if those students overall are doing better than their counterparts in more traditional school arrangements. What do the experts think? Well, Dr. Rachel Wilson, she is a senior education lecturer at the University of Sydney in Australia. She says we don't know, more or less. She says it's not clear if it improves students' performance, and it's kind of experimental, and she doesn't really think that we should be experimenting with school children, which is an understandable position to take. Anne Logsdon, a Very Well family, she discusses in her article both positives and negatives. She says there's a potential for smaller class sizes, but there could also be a potential for larger class sizes. It really depends on how the district implements a learning arrangement like this. She says homogeneous groups allow for students to feel more at ease at participating, and we know that's true through other schools who do homogeneous grouping, like all girls or all boys school. They say that's one of the benefits of going to a school like that, is that boys and girls don't feel awkward around the opposite sex. They're in homogeneous groups and they feel more comfortable participating in academic settings. Teachers can target instruction. So if you know that you have a group of students who are ready for a topic, you can teach that topic. You don't have to spend time building as much background, and you don't have to worry about students who are falling behind or who are far ahead of where you're trying to teach, because you have a homogeneous group of students who, in theory, are all ready to learn what you're ready to teach. Some drawbacks to this is that students' track might be difficult to change. So if when this is being implemented, or if when you're coming to this school, your family has had a tough time, or somebody has lost a job, grandpa died, you're moving, whatever the case may be, that student may not test as well as they otherwise would and may get put into a lower track. And once students are in those lower tracks, it might become hard to switch to a higher track. So 6 months after they've moved, after, dad found a job again and the student and the family is doing much better, are they really going to be able to catch up to their peers and change into a different track? It depends on how the district and the school sets that up. It may cause students to fall behind. So this is something else to be concerned with. If you are in a lower track and you need extra time, how much extra time is given to that student? If they give too much, that student, the gap between the higher performing students and the lower performing students is going to widen significantly. So there has to be some guardrails on whether or not, or how much time students can take to catch up, essentially. And then the other drawback is that there's no higher level peers to learn from. So you do not have a good model in your class. You don't have anything to look at and achieve towards. Because the group is homogeneous, there's not that model for those lower performing students in their classroom. Mills College wrote an article on this, and they say that splitting students on ability versus age can reduce inclusiveness and it can be inequitable. So again, you're going into these smaller homogeneous groups and they're worried that students on the lower end are going to be excluded from students on the higher end. There's the potential for remedial students to get poorer quality education. So one of their concerns was that students who are higher performing will get higher performing teachers, and students who are struggling or on those slower tracks have the greater likelihood of getting newer or poorer performing teachers. And again, that's going to widen the gap between the kids who are doing really well in school and the kids who are struggling a little bit. There's also the worry that depending on how districts set up their ability-based grouping, that teachers may be able to exert bias through broader forms of grading instead of a traditional, 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 90 is a B. There's different qualifications for students to show mastery than simple grading. Benefits were tailored content. So if you have a smaller group of homogeneous students, you get more targeted learning for things that those students are interested in and things that those students are ready to learn. And depending on the teaching style, and again, how a division like this is set up, appropriate pacing. So if it's going to take a student a week to learn a concept, they get a week to learn the concept. If those students need a little bit more time, then they get a little bit more time. If they need less time or they already know the material, they get to move on. And that's a benefit for the student because they get to spend time on what they need to spend time on. So there's been a few different schools around the country have found that have done this. Kristen Baszler, she is the superintendent over Jaguar Academy in North Dakota. She says that prior to making this change, they were teaching to the test and spending way too much time on that, which I think we can all agree has been a problem in recent years with education, all of the standardized tests. She says that now that they've made the change, educators and students tend to be more engaged and they are able to apply their learning in more meaningful ways, bringing in some of those 21st century skills. The primary goal for the reason why they did this was to give high school students more opportunities. Initially, they wanted to make a school that went more on the trades path versus college prep. So there's job shadowing and internships of all kinds now. And they've also decided to go away from grade levels and from grades. One of the things she also said, though, was that there's still a federal requirement for graded standardized testing. And so they do still keep track of grades a little bit because of federal testing requirements. But she said that's basically the only thing. They do not teach to the test. It's just something that they do once or twice a year and they move on. And then in Maine, Bill Zima, he says that his main point is that there has to be limits on experiments or different school structures like this. He says first graders are not ready to manage their time, which I would absolutely agree with as a mother of a first grader. There is no way she could manage her time efficiently or effectively in a school environment. She would end up at recess, at lunch, or coloring all of the time and wouldn't learn anything, at least anything academic. So he also says that seniors aren't ready and adults aren't ready really either, which I also agree with because I know how poorly sometimes I spend my own time. So his idea of this type of a concept has much more to do with allowing freedom within certain guidelines. And in Maine, in the Kennebec intra-district schools, he says that if students fall 3 weeks behind teacher pacing, they have a conference to figure out how they're going to catch up or what the plan is. And on the flip side, if students are pacing 3 weeks or more ahead of the teacher pacing guide, they have a meeting with the student to come up with next steps. Are they going to move on? Are they going to do an individual project that takes place, solving a problem or doing something in the community? But there's definitely a lot of different ways to implement a school structure like this, and a lot of opinions, but not a whole lot of factual data on what works best or what doesn't work. Now, I didn't come up with all of this content on my own. I had a lot of help, and here is my works cited, all the different articles I read. Thank you for listening to my presentation on a current event in education, and hope you have a good day.